You're listening to the Author Stories Podcast, bringing you the story behind the stories and the storytellers.
Margaret White,
Terry Brooks,
Sheena Kamal,
Matthew Quick,
J.T. Ellison,
Walt D. Williams,
Brad Thor,
Corey, Dr. O,
Brandon Sanderson,
Robin Hahn,
Ernest Klein, Jim Butcher,
Sherwin Harris.
Visit hankgarner.com for archives of all the shows. Today's guest is Joseph Fink. Today's episode is sponsored by editor Ellen Campbell. Authors, if you are looking for someone to help shape your words into what you originally intended them to be, Ellen can help you do that. Ellen is one of the most sought-after indie editors out today, and she is one of the best. I've used her. So many other people in the community have used her. There's a link to her website in the show notes. I'll be talking more about her as the month goes on. Well, thanks for joining me again for the Author Stories Podcast, where I bring you the story behind the stories and the storytellers. Today, I'm super excited to have Joseph Fink on the show with me today. Joseph is the author of the brand new book, Alice Isn't Dead. You probably know him from the podcast, the Runaway Success podcast of the same name, and also Welcome to Night Vale and several other projects. Welcome to the show, Joseph.
Hi, thanks for having me.
I'm excited to have you. We begin each show with the same question, and that question is, what is your first memory of wanting to be a writer or storyteller?
Yeah, I mean, storyteller is the interesting word there because, at like kids' festivals and stuff, they'll often have storytellers, like performers telling old folk tales and stuff.
Sure.
And that was always really interesting to me. So, like, from when I was old enough to talk and think, my idea was my career would be, I would be a storyteller. Like, I would stand up in front of people and tell stories. And then when I learned that's not really a career, but that there's this thing called being a writer, I was around 4 years old, I decided I'd be a writer. And that really hasn't changed much. Kind of from 4 years old on, my goal has been write books.
That's awesome. What were you a big reader as a kid?
Yeah. My parents didn't let me have like a TV or video games or much of anything. So I had hundreds and hundreds of books in my room. Like as a kid, I would read books to fall asleep, and then I would never remember to take them off the bed. So eventually, like, I'd be sleeping halfway down the bed, and just kind of everything above there would be just piles of books until my parents would make me clear it all off, and then the process would start over.
That's amazing. What kinds of stories did you really love?
I mean, that varied over time. The very first novel I ever read, at 6, I read My Teacher is an Alien, which I remember quite fondly, which was followed up by My Teacher Zapped My Dog, I think, and then the big climactic volume, My Teacher Flunked the Planet. There was a period from like 9 years old to like 11 years old where I would read fantasy books, and I would entirely choose them based on how thick they were. So just like the longer, the better. I thought I was getting like more value out of a book if it was longer. And then I burnt out so completely that like even to today, I have trouble reading fantasy. I start to zone out because I just think I so completely burned myself out. And then I grew up Jewish, and so I read a lot of like Jewish folk tales. There's a guy named, Howard Schwartz. It might be Harold Schwartz. It's Howard Schwartz, now that I say it out loud. Howard Schwartz, who collected all these, he has a ton of collections of Jewish folk tales, collected from the oral tradition and from the Talmud, and I would love those. That I would say those informed a lot of how I think about storytelling.
Love it. You said from 4 years on, you knew you were going to be a writer. Did you pursue writing in college? How did you prepare to formally be a writer?
Yeah, I mean, I wrote all the time. I started writing short stories before I could really write. I would talk out loud to my parents, and they would, I would talk out loud. I'm a writer. I know words. I would dictate to my parents, and so I wrote some stuff then before I even really knew how to like form words on a page. I was also like of the age, and then I had parents who were pretty technologically inclined. So I started learning how to type right around when I started learning how to write with a pen, to the point where I'm much more comfortable typing. I've never gotten very comfortable with writing longhand. It always goes very slowly, and I hate it. I kind of grew up thinking of a page through a word processor. Was always how I did it. The very first story, it wasn't a very good story, but it was the first short story that I would describe as like an actual adult short story and not just like a kid writing something I wrote, was when I was 10 years old. I wrote this really depressing short story about a guy who's going on a drive and he gets a car accident. And it turns out it's his wife, and she's died, and it was her birthday. So that was what I was writing at 10. So Something Awful was a fairly big comedy website at the time, and I was a big fan. And so I just kind of unsolicited wrote up an article in their style and sent it to their owner. And he wrote an email back being like, I like that, write another one, and if I like it, you're hired.
Nice.
So I wrote another one and sent it to him, and he's like, I didn't like this one, write another one. So I wrote a third one. He was like, okay, I like this one, you're hired. And so throughout kind of my time in college, I had this side job where I would write comedy articles and get paid $40 an article. And then after I left college, that kind of, it started to feel, I don't know. I started to feel like I wasn't funny, so I stopped doing that. So I think that your question was about college, so that takes me to what I was doing, was writing in college.
So you didn't feel like you were funny anymore. You weren't writing that sort of stuff anymore. I think I've seen a talk with you before where you talked about working at a job where you were trying to sign people up for green energy, and at some point through that time in your life is when Welcome to Night Vale was birthed. Is that right?
Yeah, I mean, if we want to talk about like where Night Vale came from, we'd have to back up even a little bit from that. So I moved to New York after college. I went to college where I grew up, which was Southern California. And then I moved to New York City actually 10 years ago as of yesterday.
Oh, wow.
Moved there right out of college, didn't know anyone, didn't have any job lined up, had actually never even been to New York City. And it was October 2008, so the economy had just crashed.
Nice.
So it was a wonderful time to be looking for work in New York City. And then kind of two things happened. I got this job. I mean, I hated the job, but I was lucky to have it. I got this job at a prepaid debit card company that was sort of the epitome of a soul-crushing office job, but it did pay okay. And then I also I got involved with a theater company there called the New York Neo-Futurists that did performance art and personal theater. And I learned so much about what was possible with writing and performance from watching them work. And then incidentally, I met almost everyone important to me in my life through that theater company. My wife was a member of that theater company. Jeffrey Craner, who's my co-writer on Welcome to Night Vale and on multiple novels, he was a member of that company. Cecil Baldwin, who is the main performer of Welcome to Night Vale, was a member of that company. So I met them through that and kind of started doing various projects with them, all while working at this prepaid debit card company and this job I hated. And then kind of two things happened within a few months of each other. One was that my dad died. And then the second was that I got fired from the prepaid debit card company job. And so I was suddenly unemployed and in mourning for my dad. And it was then that I started writing these paragraphs about this weird desert town, which it wasn't until years later that I figured out that was probably me dealing with the death of my dad in kind of a very indirect way. the signing people up for green energy job kind of came a couple months into working on Night Vale. And so, yeah, for the first couple years of making Welcome to Night Vale, the podcast, I was also had another really bad job of standing on a table at a street on a street in New York City and asking people if they wanted to sign a thing.
Amazing. Why did you guys choose to podcast Night Vale? You're a writer. You're writing these stories. The traditional thinking would be that this is a collection of stories that would make a fantastic novel. Why would you decide to podcast it?
I mean, well, because it's actually that's kind of backwards in that Night Vale came second. What came first was podcasting. Jeffrey and I both loved podcasts. We would listen to them. We'd talk about them all the time. And so I knew I wanted to make a podcast, and I knew I wanted to make it with Jeffrey. I didn't have anything else. I just knew those two things. And at the time, podcasts were almost entirely nonfiction. I mean, they still kind of are. Fiction podcasting is still really struggling to get seen, although there's a lot of it now. But at the time, there was no fiction podcast that I even knew of. And so I was thinking about nonfiction, but there was nothing we could really do. And eventually, I came up with this idea of Welcome to Night Vale, this small desert town where every conspiracy theory was true. And so I started working on that without any real clear idea if it would even work as a podcast. And it wasn't really until I even put together the first episode, which is exactly the test episode I put together is exactly the episode that's still out there. And that's what I gave to Jeffrey. I hadn't even reached out to Jeffrey until I put together the episode, and I sent it to him and was like, here's what I'm thinking. Do you want to make this with me?
Wow. And it really comes full circle back to that original desire to be a storyteller in the old folk tale tradition. Even though Welcome to Night Vale takes a different presentation, it's really kind of the heart of that thing, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, I think Night Vale came out of, it does come out of oral storytelling, but it also comes out of the type of theater that the New York Near Futures were doing. They did a weekly show in the East Village in a little black box theater called the Crane Theater that used to be called Too Much Light Makes the Baby Go Blind. It was 30 plays in 60 minutes that were all pre-written plays. So it was these constant bursts of little bits of performance. And I learned a lot about, they didn't have much in the way of props or costumes or sets because they were making theater in New York City, so they had no money. And so I learned a lot about how it is possible to really transport someone using nothing but, your words, using nothing but who you are, your words, and how you say those words. And so I really wanted to recreate that in a podcast form. Which is why there's little to no sound effects in Welcome to Night Vale, and there's almost never dialogue. It's almost entirely one person telling you a story.
Right.
Because the most interesting thing is just finding make that as anything else.
Sure. The success of that podcast, it grew exponentially, got the attention of people in all over the entertainment industry. You later novelized that there's a Welcome to Night Vale novel, and then you guys have branched out to do other things. Alice Isn't Dead being the most prominent podcast, and now a novel for that. When taking a property that you have worked on in the podcasting space and looking at telling a story that way, and then writing the novelization of that, how do you approach those two different projects as a writer?
I mean, when you write anything, you write it thinking about where it's going to go. Because I write podcasts, I write novels, I also write live shows. we do regular live show tours of Welcome to Night Vale, and we've also done a couple live shows of Alice Isn't Dead, and each of those can't be written in the same way. Each of those has to be written with a different thing in mind. So for it's a podcast, it's obviously it's entirely about how it sounds, and so I read it out loud multiple times. I not only read it out loud, but I try to perform it as to find the things an actor would, so that I can play around with that and help them build their performance, and also encounter any problems that would come up if you try to perform it before the actors find those problems. With a live show, it's entirely about the interaction with the audience. Even if you're not directly interacting with them, even if you're just performing for them, live performance is entirely about a transfer of energy between you and an audience. And you write a script for that, you always have to be thinking about where is the audience's energy here and where do I want it to go next. And then with a novel, obviously, audiobooks exist, but I don't really write for those. I write for what it looks like on a page. And so it's a lot more about visual rhythm. You can write much more complex sentences in a novel than you can in a live show or a podcast, because when someone has to perform writing out loud, the structure has to be kept fairly simple. The sentences need to be fairly short and to the point, so that the actor doesn't get lost in the sentence. But with a novel, you can just kind of let the text run and not worry about whether it would be possible to perform that out loud.
Let's talk about Alice Isn't Dead. Where did this story come from? And tell us about the main character and where she enters the story.
So Alice Isn't Dead is about a woman named Keisha, who's a truck driver searching the country for her wife, who she thought was dead, but it turns out is not. It came out of two things. One is the Welcome to Night Vale live shows. We started doing these live shows. We started touring them. At this point, in the last 5 years, we've done something like 330 live shows in 35 states and 17 countries. And so I've spent a lot of my life over the last 5 years sitting in a van driving around the country. Until then, I hadn't really seen a lot of America, and at this point, I've driven most of it. And so I started just taking notes as we drove, and I just ended up with a ton of notes about driving around the country and looking for something to do with those. And then at the same time, Jessica Nicole is an actor who has worked with Welcome to Night Vale, and she did a live show with us in which I wrote her a monologue, and then I was sitting in the back running sound, and she performed that monologue and just really nailed it. It was beautiful watching her perform that, just watching her take the language to life. And so I knew I needed to write more stuff for her. And so coming into Alice Isn't Dead, the original ideas were just a road trip and something for her to perform. And then I started kind of building out this world slowly that way. I know there's a lot of writers who like to build out an entire world first, and they draw maps and figure out the history. And none of that really works for me. For me, I find that a world builds itself as long as you are careful with continuity, as long as you make sure that everything you write has consequence and weight and sticks around. If you do that enough, eventually the world just kind of grows from that.
There's similarities between Night Vale and Alice Isn't Dead, obviously, but you seem to have a love of the kind of conspiracy theories and these kind of odd tales of things that just don't that we like to think about, but they don't necessarily show up in mainstream conversation. What is it about these kinds of story elements and that really get your creative juices flowing?
I mean, I've always loved conspiracy theories. They've always been very interesting to me. I'd never believed them, but I think they're really incredible stories. I think they are, in essence, religious stories, in that they function the same way religious stories do. They help the people who believe a conspiracy theory believe it because it helps them understand why the world is the way it is. in the same way that it's helpful to believe in any number of religious structures of the universe in order to understand why things happen the way they do. It's easier to believe that there's a vast conspiracy involving the Cubans and the mafia and the CIA. It's easier to believe that than it is to believe that a single person with a gun can kill a president. It's more comforting to believe that. As I said, I grew up with Jewish stories, and so religious stories are a big part of the way I think about storytelling. So yeah, I guess conspiracy theories appeal to me as religious stories in the way they function as those.
Let's talk for a minute about anxiety. Your main character in Alice Isn't Dead, Keisha, she deals with anxiety. Why is this such a personal topic to you? And is writing Keisha's story is that a catharsis for you in a way?
I don't know about a catharsis. I mean, writing is so slow, that I don't think it can ever be cathartic for the person writing it. It can be very cathartic to read someone else's, but the process of creating it is so tedious and involves such a very slow build-in. There's a reason people love behind-the-scenes videos about movies or music, but nobody wants to watch behind the scenes of a novel because it's just a person sitting at a desk for hours and hours and days and months and months. And so it's hard to get cathartic out of that. It's more just, I guess getting some of that out of my brain. I mean, I've had anxiety, again, actually about a decade now. I've definitely had anxiety my whole life. I can, thinking back at things in my childhood that I don't think I realized were anxiety, but definitely were. But it became acute in 2009-ish. I reached a point where I was having trouble functioning as a human being because of my anxiety. And that would come and go. Welcome to Night Vale, when I wrote it, I was able to channel a lot of my anxiety into that. I was able to kind of, not directly, I rarely write about anxiety in Welcome to Night Vale, but I do write about a lot of the things that make me anxious. And that actually helped my anxiety a lot. It was kind of therapeutic to, I think in the same way that journaling can be therapeutic. It was therapeutic to just kind of get those words out of my head. And so I actually, my anxiety after I started writing Welcome to Night Vale. And it seemed interesting to have a character that specifically had the same way I had it. And it fits, I think, with somebody living through a horror story, right? She's living through a very scary thing. But when you have anxiety, you're scared of everything. And so it kind of prepares you for dealing with scary things, I guess, because it's hard to get a lot more afraid than you already are.
When you're writing for the podcast, either Welcome to Night Vale or Alice Isn't Dead, there's a certain give and take with the audience where you get, you produce an episode, you write the episode, you produce it, you put it out, and you can get near instant feedback, from people that are listening and, consuming the content. And then, that may or may not shape, the next part of the story that comes out. Depending on how much you have planned already, or maybe, you're getting feedback from people that, okay, I like this storyline. I don't know what your creative process is there, but that's possible, for that to happen. When you're writing a novel, you don't get that feedback, and it's a very solitary pursuit. And, with the exception of editors and maybe some, beta readers, everyone in the world gets the entire story all at once. How has the novel writing process been for you, when you are so used to, getting feedback from the audience as it comes out?
I mean, not that much different, mainly because we absolutely ignore feedback. I don't we don't ignore all feedback. If somebody, we definitely had times where someone was like, hey, I'm sure you meant well, but this isn't the best way of saying this. And yeah, if we accidentally wrote something offensive, that's a case where we need to listen to that and make it right. Or even just not even if we wrote something offensive, but if we just weren't representing the world as it is. People were pointing out, hey, you don't really have anyone that's not on the gender binary that isn't like a weird creature. Can you just have like a person who's not on the gender binary? And we were like, oh yeah, that makes total sense. So that kind of feedback we listen to. But otherwise, I have no interest in what people want out of the story, because trying to chase that seems like a losing game, because everyone wants something different. And also, there's a difference between what someone thinks they want and what they actually want in most cases. So with the podcast, we've always just tried to write a story that seems interesting to us and hope that if it's interesting to us, it'll be interesting to at least one other person. But yeah, it's impossible to chase feedback with a series, which means that, yeah, writing the novel really isn't that different. It's still just telling the same story. I mean, the main difference with Alice is everything I've written for the last 8 years or so, basically, other than Alice Isn't Dead, I've written with Jeffrey Craner. And so we've established just this working relationship of just absolute trust in each other's abilities and like this great back and forth with that. And it was very hard losing that safety net. When I'm writing, actually right now, one of the reasons I'm so busy right now is I'm kind of in crunch time with a novel that I'm writing with Jeffrey. And, when you do that, you can write a chapter and know it's not good enough. Be like, this isn't ready yet. But then you can also be like, that's fine, Jeffrey will fix this. And the same the other direction. You have another pair of eyes waiting, they aren't just going to give notes, they're going to fundamentally rewrite the chapter, and you trust them to do that. And that helps a lot. It gives you a lot of confidence in writing a thing. And it was terrifying writing this novel because no one read it except for my editor until it was done. I didn't show it to any of my friends or anything, which isn't like a philosophical thing. It's just sort of how the process turned out. And so, yeah, I with everything, I didn't have that second pair of eyes on the drafts until I turned them in. I just had to be like, I think this is good enough, so I'm going to move on.
While your signature humor and kind of the wry, dry humor is evident in this book, Alice Isn't Dead is a little darker than Welcome to Night Vale. Was that intentional, or is it just kind of the way the story?
I mean, it was intentional. Yeah, I was interested in writing a horror story that was just straight up a horror story that wasn't a horror comedy. That said, I do think that Welcome to Night Vale is darker than it's often as dark as Alice. It varies. There's times that Welcome to Night Vale is played as a comedy, but we've definitely written stuff that has been intentionally kind of straightforward horror. So there had been some of that, but it was kind of refreshing in a way. Like that was kind of what Alice started was just being able to write something that had a very different voice and very different world than Night Vale. In Night Vale, nothing is weird because everything is weird and people are used to it. And so there's no element of people being horrified by what's happening. Whereas Alice Isn't Dead takes place within our world. So when things get weird or horrifying, the people react to that. And so it's just a very different voice to write in.
And moving the story out of Night Vale and out into the real world affords you the opportunities to actually scare. I love that. Joseph, the new book Alice Isn't Dead is when people are hearing this, it's available everywhere. There's just a link to it in the show notes at hankgarner.com. If people are just learning about you and about your work, where can they find you online to follow along with everything that you do?
Yeah, I don't have like a personal website. There's a few different things. My own Twitter is Planet of Finks, Fink as in my last name. There's also the podcast network that I co-own and that all of my podcasts are through, Night Vale Presents. So if you go to nightvalepresents.com, there's links to Alice Isn't Dead and Welcome to Night Vale and all of the other shows on that network. Those are kind of probably the two best places to find me.
Excellent. We'll send everyone to pick up their copy of Alice Isn't Dead. Joseph, thank you so much for taking time to come on the show today.
Yeah, thank you.
Thanks for listening to the Author Stories podcast. For more great author interviews like this one, go to hankgarner.com and dig through the archives. There's something there I know you'll love. Now stay tuned for a special audio clip from Richard Gleaves' The Jason Crane series.
What in the name of Carl Sagan was he doing in the cemetery on Halloween? What was he thinking? He whirled, expecting the Headless Horseman himself to be waiting on the road ahead. Or was he lurking behind? He wanted to run, but now the bridge ahead worried him. Doesn't the horseman haunt bridges? Could he avoid crossing it somehow? It terrified him. Why? It was just a stupid bridge. The gloom beneath could have been the lair of a troll. Billy Goat's Gruff. Mama used to read that. The troll waits beneath for the fattest, sweetest goat. Jason thought he saw something on the far end of the bridge, a shape of some sort. He stepped onto the bridge and gripped the knotty railing. He felt the ground drop away beneath as he edged forward. His eyes remained on the shape. It's nothing. It's nothing. Is it nothing? No troll attacked him as he reached the other shore. The looming shape was only a stupid stairwell opposite the bridge that climbed up the hill and into the main cemetery. He turned left and ran, admitting defeat and letting the fear take him over. He ran southward down the long, dark road. His initial burst of adrenaline ran its course and he slowed, then walked again, limping a little. Headstones slipped past on the right. He still had enough light that he caught his reflection occasionally in the polished stone. He looked very young and very thin. He could feel his vulnerability as he walked along. He grew aware of his own body, the touch of his starchy dress shirt and his jacket and the soft weight of his backpack. He saw himself reflected in the headstones, just a container of warm fluids, flimsy work for a blade or a hoof or a sword. He felt shatterable and transient, and his next breath was not guaranteed, oh no. The leaves made a faint oceanic rustle all around. The insects sang their three-note songs. Jason Crane, Jason Crane, Jason Crane. Jason sang a wretched pop song as he walked, something about having no self-control and no bitches and not enough money. He sang it softly, absent-mindedly, as if reciting a psalm. He passed Reese, Finnerton, Bain, Ekdal, Forest, Black, Small. There. He saw the gate at the end of the road. But the gate would be locked, he remembered. He would have to climb the embankment and cross over the churchyard. He could see the spire of the church above and the weather vane spinning against the sky. He would rather climb this gate than face that churchyard, but the spikes on top made leaping the fence impossible. Okay, just be quick. Something caught his ear, a brittle, clipping sound. He scanned the crest above and saw a horse silhouetted among the graves. It looked to be tied to a branch of the locust tree. He had heard its hooves as it shifted from foot to foot. It rustled somehow. His breath caught. He forced himself to be calm and rational. Some Halloween thing, maybe, for some event. He found the stairs and ascended, sideways, ready to bolt if necessary. He watched the horse, but when he neared the top he saw the rider, standing upon the shallow depression of the horseman's grave. The figure was motionless, a dim shape that absorbed light and gave nothing back. He could make out the shape of the boots and the legs and two arms held away from the body, palms down. Just a man? But the cape of the thing was not normal. It contorted painfully, twisting in the air even though the wind wasn't blowing. It wrung itself and billowed and whipped slowly, as if the figure wore a wave torn from a black ocean. And above its shoulders, is he headless? Is he headless?